Brunei Bay, October 18, 1944. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Atago and read the order from Admiral Toyoda in Tokyo. It was not a long document. It said that Kurita would take his fleet, 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers, through the San Bernardino Strait, around the island of Samar, and into Leyte Gulf. There, he would destroy the American landing fleet supporting MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines. He would do this without air cover. He would do this with no guarantee of resupply. He would do this knowing that American submarines were already tracking his ships in the Palawan Passage. Kurita read the order. He folded it. He did not speak to his staff for several minutes. No one recorded what he was thinking. What we know is the sentiment that circulated through his fleet before it sailed, recorded in post-war accounts by officers who were there. The phrase passed among Kurita's staff before they left Brunei: "Never die among empty ships." No one recorded it as a direct order. It was not in any official document. What the accounts describe is a mood, an understanding shared without being spoken plainly, that the men of the center force did not intend to die attacking transport vessels, while the real American fleet was somewhere else. That if there was going to be a final battle, it would be worth fighting. The phrase was, in the context of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1944, a departure from doctrine. Official doctrine said the mission mattered above everything. Ships were tools. Men were instruments of the Emperor's will. You expended both without reservation in service of the objective. Never die among empty ships said something different. Said that, if the objective was worthless, the death was worthless. And the officers in that fleet understood exactly what kind of objective they had been given. This is not a story about what happened at Samar. This is a story about the man who already knew how it would end, before he ever left the harbor. To understand what Kurita was reading that morning, you have to understand what Japan was reading by October 1944. The Philippine Sea had happened 4 months earlier. In a single day, June 19th, Japan had lost 426 aircraft, not over weeks, not across a campaign. One day. The carrier fleet that Japan had spent 2 decades building, that had struck Pearl Harbor and ruled the Pacific in the opening year of the war, was gone as a functioning force. The pilots who had flown those planes were gone with them. The ones who survived were too few and too green to matter. Saipan had fallen in July. The island's fall was not just a military defeat, it was a geographical catastrophe. From Saipan, American B-29s could reach Tokyo. The Japanese Prime Minister understood this so clearly that he resigned the day the island fell. He had been in office since before Pearl Harbor. He left without a public statement. By October, American forces were at Leyte, in the Philippines. If the Philippines fell, the sea lanes connecting Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the oil that kept the fleet moving, the oil that kept the factories running, the oil that kept the war going, would be cut permanently. Japan would be an island nation with no oil, fighting an industrial war against the largest industrial economy in human history. Admiral Toyoda, commander of Japan's combined fleet, understood the mathematics of this as clearly as anyone alive. He had been in command since May 1944. He had inherited a navy already badly damaged by Midway and Guadalcanal, rebuilt it as best he could, and then watched it lose 426 aircraft in a single day at the Philippine Sea. He was a precise, unsentimental man, described by his own officers as brilliant and difficult in almost equal measure. He had no patience for comfortable illusions. He later described his decision to activate Show 1, the plan that sent Kurita to Leyte, in language that does not require translation. He called it as difficult as swallowing molten iron. He activated it anyway, because the alternative, doing nothing while the Philippines fell, was the same as accepting that the war was already lost. And that was not a conclusion the Imperial Japanese Navy was prepared to write down on paper in October 1944. There is a word in Japanese, gyokusai, that translates roughly as shattered jewel. It describes the act of fighting to complete destruction, rather than accepting surrender or defeat. It had been used to describe Japanese garrisons on Attu, on Saipan, on islands across the Pacific where the last surviving defenders formed up and attacked, knowing they would all die. Showan was gyokusai at the level of a fleet. Toyoda understood this. He signed the activation order from an office in Tokyo, 600 miles from the nearest Japanese warship. Showan required 3 separate forces to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously. The first, Nishimura's southern force, would approach through Surigao Strait from the south. 2 old battleships, a heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers. What the plan did not say, what no order specified, was that Nishimura and his men were being sent to die, so that Kurita would have a better approach angle. The second, Ozawa's northern force, would approach from the north. 4 aircraft carriers, carrying fewer than 100 aircraft between them. Ozawa's mission was not to fight. His mission was to be seen, to appear on American radar screens as a target worth chasing north. Away from the landing beaches, away from Leyte Gulf, away from the gap he was supposed to be guarding. Ozawa knew exactly what he was. He accepted it. He would say so, after the war, without bitterness, in the flat language of a man describing a professional calculation he had agreed to and carried out. The third force was Kurita's center force. 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, each carrying 9 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell the weight of a small automobile 25 miles. 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still put to sea. His route went through the Palawan Passage, narrow, deep, ideal water for submarines. Then across the Sibuyan Sea under American air attack, then through the San Bernardino Strait, then south along the coast of Samar to Leyte Gulf. No air cover assigned. When one of his staff officers asked about it, the answer from Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo was, "Trust in divine guidance." October 23, 1944, 1:16 hours, Palawan Passage. The USS Darter was running on the surface in darkness when her radar picked up contacts. Many contacts. Moving in formation, Commander David McClintock turned his submarine toward them. At 0524, Darter fired 6 torpedoes at Otago. 4 struck. 13 minutes later, Otago capsized. At 0554, the Dace fired 4 torpedoes into the Maya. She blew up almost immediately, sinking in minutes. Darter then reloaded and at 0634 put 2 more into the Takao. Kurita went into the water. He was 55 years old. He had commanded warships for over 30 years. He had never in his career swum for his life in oil-slicked water, surrounded by burning ships and dead men. The Otago went down fast. She had been hit at the bow and amidships almost simultaneously. Men who were below decks when the torpedoes struck had almost no time. Kurita was on the bridge. He went over the side and swam. The water in the Palawan Passage that morning was thick with fuel oil from the burning ships. Swimmers had to keep their mouths closed. The oil burned the eyes. The destroyers that came to pick up survivors had to navigate around debris. Wreckage, life jackets, men. 360 of Otago's crew did not make it out. Kurita was in the water for roughly 2 hours before a destroyer pulled him out. There is no account of what he looked like when they brought him aboard. No photograph, no detailed written description. What the record shows is that he was transferred, soaking wet, covered in fuel oil, to the Yamato, where a staff officer handed him a dry uniform, and he walked to the bridge and assumed command. He did not rest. He had no time to rest. The fleet was still moving east, and somewhere ahead, American carrier aircraft were already being briefed on the contact reports the darter had transmitted before dawn. Consider what that crossing to the Yamato meant. The Otago had been his flagship. His staff was there. His communications equipment was there. The documents, the codes, the operational planning that a fleet commander needed to function were there. Some of it was gone with the ship. Some of it had been transferred. What could not be transferred was the hours of preparation, the familiarity with his own bridge and his own staff, the particular confidence that comes from commanding from a ship you know. He stepped onto the Yamato as a guest in someone else's command post and began issuing orders. His fleet had already lost 2 heavy cruisers. A third, the Takao badly damaged by darter, was limping westward, escorted by 2 destroyers he could no longer use. Before the Sibuyan Sea, before the American aircraft, before a single Japanese gun had fired at an American ship, the opening move of Show 1 had already cost him a significant fraction of his striking power, and the mission had not changed. The order had not been recalled. Tokyo had not sent word that the situation had been reassessed. He continued. October 24, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. The first American aircraft arrived at 091. They came in waves. Helldiver's Avengers, Hellcat fighters flying escort. Through the morning and into the afternoon they came back. Wave after wave. Kurita's ships maneuvered at high speed, guns firing, destroyers laying smoke. The sea churned with near misses and explosions. The Musashi absorbed more punishment than any ship had a right to survive. She took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before she finally slowed. Her bow went under first. She rolled to starboard. At 1935, she capsized, taking 1,023 men with her, more than a third of her crew. Kurita watched from the bridge of the Yamato. At 1600, with his fleet still under attack and his flagship shuddering from near misses, Kurita sent a message to Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo. His force was suffering heavy losses, and he was turning back. He turned west. An hour later, Tokyo responded. All forces will dash to the attack, trusting in divine guidance. It was the same phrase, the same answer as before. Kurita read it. He turned his fleet back east. Not because the message changed the mathematics. Not because the situation had improved. The Musashi was still at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. The Otago was still gone. The mission was still exactly what it had been in Brunei. He turned east because the alternative was to anchor his fleet and wait for someone in Tokyo to acknowledge that the plan had failed. And that was somewhat not how the Imperial Japanese Navy ended wars. He crossed the San Bernardino Strait in darkness. No one was waiting for him on the other side. Halsey had taken his carriers north, chasing Ozawa's bait. The strait was empty. For the first time in 3 days, no American aircraft were overhead. No submarines were visible. The sea was quiet. One of Kurita's staff officers recorded in his log that the men who had been at battle stations for 48 hours were, in those hours crossing the strait, something he did not have a word for. Not relieved, not hopeful. A quieter state than either of those things. They were still moving. They were still afloat. That was what they knew. What they did not know, what no one on any Japanese ship knew, was what had happened to the rest of the plan. Nishimura's southern force had entered Surigao Strait hours earlier. American PT boats had been tracking him since midnight. Destroyers had attacked with torpedoes. Then the old American battleships. 6 of them, 5 of which had survived Pearl Harbor, raised from the mud and repaired and brought back, had waited at the top of the strait. They had crossed the T on Nishimura's column and fired at point-blank range in the dark. Nishimura's flagship, the Yamashiro, had gone down with him aboard. The Fuso had broken in 2. Of the southern force, a single destroyer survived a retreat. Kurita had received no word of this. He had been operating for 3 days with fragmentary communications, no air cover, and no reliable intelligence on what was happening anywhere except directly in front of his guns. He was moving toward an objective he had described to his own officers as worthless, and he was moving toward it blind. Kurita remained on the bridge of the Yamato as the fleet turned south along the coast of Samar. The night was clear. Nobody spoke about what was waiting in the morning. That had already been settled, in Brunei before they sailed, and again at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea with the Musashi. He had been awake since before the Otago went down. His flagship had been torpedoed and sunk beneath him. He had swum through oil and burning seawater. He had watched the largest battleship in the world go under. He had received an order from Tokyo that was, in practical terms, indistinguishable from a death sentence, and he had followed it. At 0644 on October 25, 1944, standing on the bridge of the Yamato with the first light rising over Samar, Kurita looked south and saw shapes on the horizon. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, a large American fleet positioned directly between him and Leyte Gulf. He ordered his ships to battle stations. What he was seeing was Task Unit 7943, call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Taffy 3 was not a battle fleet. It was a support group, built to fly patrol aircraft over landing beaches and hunt submarines. Its carriers were merchant hulls, fitted with flight decks, built so fast that some had gone from keel to commissioning in less than 10 months. Its guns could not penetrate the armor of a Japanese cruiser at any range that mattered. Kurita did not know this. He saw carriers on the horizon and concluded he had intercepted part of Halsey's main fleet. The aircraft flying overhead were launching from those decks. American radio traffic was everywhere, urgent and scrambled. The destroyers were moving fast, throwing up smoke. To a man who had spent 2 days absorbing air attacks from American fleet carriers, what he was looking at was consistent with what fleet carriers looked like from a distance. He ordered general attack. In the vocabulary of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was an unusual command. It meant every ship was to engage independently, choosing its own targets, fighting at its own discretion, not the coordinated assault the battle plan called for. The order of a commander who had stopped being able to see the whole picture and was trusting his captains to fight. The battleships and cruisers of the center force opened fire at 0658. Yamato's forward turrets elevated and discharged for the first time in anger. The shells she fired weighed over 3,000 pounds each. At that range, roughly 17 miles, they took nearly a minute to arrive. The colored dye loads in the shells left long streaks across the sky, so spotters could distinguish each ship's fire. Red from Yamato, yellow from Nagato, blue from Haruna. The ocean around the American carriers erupted in columns of colored water, each one taller than the ship being straddled. On the bridge of Taffy 3's flagship, Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watched the shells land and understood in seconds what he was looking at. He had served in the Navy for over 30 years. He knew exactly what guns fired shells that size. He turned to his radio operator and broadcast in plain, uncoded language, because there was no time for anything else. That he was under attack by Japanese battleships and needed help immediately. The response from Halsey, 500 miles north, nothing for over an hour. The response from Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. His battleships had expended most of their ammunition at Surigao Strait at hours earlier and were too far away. Sprague had 6 escort carriers doing 19 knots. Kurita had battleships doing 25. The gap was closing at roughly 6 knots, a mile every 10 minutes. The math was simple and the conclusion was obvious. Sprague gave the only orders available to him: make smoke, launch everything that could fly, and run. What happened next lasted 2 hours and 44 minutes. The destroyers of Taffy 3, ships that had no business charging a fleet of battleships, turned directly toward Kurita's force and attacked. The Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer 376 feet long, drove straight into the Japanese formation at flank speed. Her captain, Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, who had told his crew at commissioning that this was going to be a fighting ship, and that anyone who disagreed should leave, had already ordered a torpedo run before the attack order reached him. He fired 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. One struck. Kumano fell out of formation and did not return to the battle. Yamato's 18-inch guns turned on Johnston. 3 shells struck her bridge simultaneously. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand. He moved to the back of the bridge and continued to direct the fight. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, smaller than the Johnston, built for anti-submarine work, positioned herself between the carriers and the Japanese cruisers and fired everything she had. Her crew called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. She sank at 0935. Her survivors spent the next 2 days in shark-infested water before they were found. From the carriers, aircraft launched with whatever ordnance they had loaded for the morning's patrol missions: depth charges, anti-submarine rockets, general-purpose bombs not designed for ship attacks. When they ran out of ordnance, pilots made dry runs, diving on Japanese ships with empty bomb bays to force the gunners to keep their heads down and break targeting solutions. The Japanese shells, armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate the belt armor of battleships, passed through the thin hulls of the escort carriers without detonating. A shell built to bury itself in 6 inches of hardened steel before its fuse activated had no mechanism for what it found inside a converted merchant hull. It entered one side and exited the other, leaving a clean hole, killing men in its path, but not exploding. The Gambier Bay was the exception. She had dropped behind the others, taking hits that reduced her speed further. By 0852, she was dead in the water. Japanese cruisers closed to point-blank range. At 0907, she capsized. Nearly 800 of her crew went into the water. Most were rescued the following day. From the bridge of the Yamato, Kurita watched his heavy cruisers being hit repeatedly by aircraft and small-caliber fire. The Kumano was already gone from the formation. The Suzuya was burning. The Chokai had been struck and was losing speed. The Chikuma was taking fire from multiple directions. The Yamato herself had been forced to turn north and run at full speed for nearly 10 minutes to comb the tracks of a torpedo spread. 9 torpedoes from 3 small destroyers crossing her bow. The largest battleship in the world, flagship of the most powerful surface force Japan had left, running from destroyer escorts. When Yamato finally turned back south, the battle had moved away from her. Her 18-inch guns had never found a target they could fix on long enough to hit. The American destroyers kept coming back. Every time one was hit, it turned back into the Japanese formation and fired again. Evans on the Johnston was shot through the chest at some point in the battle. He continued giving orders from the stern. When Johnston finally stopped dead in the water and the abandoned ship order was given, a Japanese destroyer came alongside to administer the killing shot. Her crew stood at attention. Her captain came to the wing of the bridge. He saluted the sinking American destroyer. The survivors in the water watching said nothing was spoken. Nothing needed to be said. At 0911, Kurita sent a message to his fleet: cease attack and reassemble to the north. The carriers were still visible. The gap to Leyte Gulf was roughly 40 miles. Behind those carriers, in the anchorage at Leyte, the entire logistics and support fleet for MacArthur's invasion sat at anchor. Transports, ammunition ships, fuel vessels, unprotected, within reach. Kurita had, in his judgment, just fought a major engagement against part of Halsey's fleet. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers. He had no air cover. He did not know where the rest of Halsey's force was. He had heard nothing from Ozawa. He knew only his piece of the plan, and his piece of it was bleeding. He turned north. He waited. The next 85 minutes are among the most studied and least understood in the history of naval command. Kurita's fleet milled north of Samar while he tried to get a picture of what was happening around him. The communications architecture that Show 1 had depended on, coordinated signals between 3 forces converging simultaneously, had essentially collapsed. His radio room was pulling in fragments. Distress calls in plain language from American commanders. Static, partial intercepts that suggested large forces to the south, nothing coherent. Nothing that told him what had actually happened at Surigao Strait, or where Halsey was, or whether any part of the plan he had sailed from Breu to execute was still intact. One message did come through during this period, from Combined Fleet Headquarters. It said that a powerful enemy task force was approaching from the northeast. That task force did not exist. The message was based on faulty intelligence. But Kurita had no way to know that. What he had was a signal from his own headquarters telling him that more American forces were closing in, on top of the fleet he believed he had just fought. On top of the ships he could see had not been destroyed. On top of 3 days of accumulated damage and exhaustion and dead sailors floating in the water behind him across 2 seas. He received nothing else. At 12:36, he turned his fleet back toward San Bernardino Strait. After the war, American officers interviewed Kurita as part of the Strategic Bombing Survey. The systematic effort to understand, from the inside, exactly how Japan had been beaten. He was asked about the decision to turn north at 0911. He gave several answers over several years, across multiple interviews and informal conversations. The answers were not consistent. He said he believed the carriers were fleet carriers. He said he was concerned about fuel. He said he thought Halsey's main force was closing from the north. He said he concluded that entering Leyte Gulf would cost more than it gained. None of the officers who served under him, none of the historians who spent decades studying the engagement, arrived at a consensus about which answer, if any, was the real one. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Koyanagi, was also interviewed. When American officers asked directly, whose decision was the withdrawal, Kurita alone or a staff recommendation, Koyanagi said the decision had been unanimous. Every officer present had agreed. He was then asked whether the staff had been united in support. He said, almost unanimous. The decision was unanimous. The interviewer noted the phrasing. He asked again. Koyanagi did not clarify. There was one more thing the post-war record established clearly. Kurita had never received word that Ozawa's decoy plan had worked. He did not know that Halsey had taken his entire carrier fleet north. He did not know that at the moment he was fighting Taffy 3, the path to Leyte Gulf was open. That the force he believed was waiting for him behind those escort carriers did not exist. Halsey was 500 miles away. The strait behind Kurita was unguarded. He had turned away from an objective that was, in that moment, undefended. He had made his decision based on a threat that was not there. Whether knowing that would have changed his decision is a question that cannot be answered. Kurita is gone. The men who were with him are gone. The morning is gone. What remains is the record, a fleet of battleships, 40 miles from its objective, turning away, and a question that 32 years of living did not resolve. Kurita was reassigned after Leyte Gulf, not court-martialed, not publicly blamed. Reassigned, given command of the Naval Academy at Etajima, a posting as far from operational command as the Japanese Navy could find. The officers who had sent him to Leyte were still in their posts. Toyota remained commander of the combined fleet through the end of the war. He stood trial at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and was acquitted. The tribunal finding that he could not be held personally responsible for the orders he had issued. He died in 1957 in Tokyo in his own bed. The Imperial Japanese Navy never mounted another major surface operation after Leyte Gulf. The ships that survived, including Yamato, remained in port. Fuel was too scarce, the threat from American submarines and aircraft too constant, the strategic situation too far gone to justify risking what was left. Yamato sailed once more, in April 1945, sent toward Okinawa, with enough fuel to reach the island but not to return. American aircraft found her before she arrived. She absorbed bomb hit after torpedo hit before her forward magazine detonated. The explosion was visible from the Japanese coast, 60 miles away. More than 2,700 of her crew died. She never fired her main guns at another warship. Not at Samar. Not anywhere. Of the officers and men Kurita had commanded off Samar, the majority were dead before the war ended. Kurita lived through the bombing. He lived through the surrender. He lived through the occupation. He outlived most of the men who had served under him and most of the men who had sent him to Leyte. He died in 1977. He was 88 years old. In the 32 years between Leyte Gulf and his death, he gave occasional interviews to historians and journalists. He spoke about the battle in the careful, precise language of a man who had thought about it for decades. He never settled on one explanation. He never stopped being asked. The USS Johnston was found in 2021 at 21,180 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located. Her hull was largely intact. Her guns were still trained outboard, in the direction of the Japanese fleet. Commander Evans was never found. His Medal of Honor, the first awarded to a Native American in the United States Navy, was presented posthumously to his family. The men who served in Taffy 3 came home and lived their lives. They were truck drivers and teachers, and lawyers and farmers. They raised children who would grow up never knowing that their fathers had once turned a 376-foot destroyer directly toward the largest fleet Japan had left. Some of them spoke about it. Most did not often, not in detail. What they carried was not easy to explain to someone who had not been there. The particular mathematics of a morning when the thing that should have happened did not happen. When the enemy turned away, and no one on those ships could tell you why, and no one ever fully could. Takeo Kurita sailed back through San Bernardino Strait on the night of October 25, 1944. He had the largest surface fleet Japan could still put to sea. He turned around. He never explained it in a way that satisfied anyone. He had 32 more years to try. If your father or grandfather was in those waters, on any of those ships, any side of that morning, leave his name below. Ship, branch, whatever you know. The official history of Leyte Gulf is numbers and maps and command decisions. The real history is the men who were there and had to live inside the answer to a question nobody could explain.